So, welcome to DiveCloud. What I'm going to show you here is we're going to start with the basic steps of what Nouvola DiveCloud can do for you in creating tests for checking the performance of the applications, APIs, and microservices. Then we are going to go a little bit more in details on some of the advanced features that the product has. And also, like I said, if you have more questions, we can also go over that. So what you see on this page is the typical landing page when you log in for the first time and register into the account. And feel free to register if you like to. There's also free accounts that you can use. So as you can see, the main bulk is divided here in 3 steps. So one is the task creation, then there's the execution, and then is the analysis of the results. So we are going to focus mostly on the task creation and obviously also in the visualization of the results. The execution is pretty straightforward, and we're going to also look into that. And we're going to show also different ways on how you can create a test and execute a test. So I'm going to start with an example of an existing application that probably is rather familiar to many of you. So what we're going to do is just to record a session that could be like a typical session of the set of transactions that a user would do in any other application. Okay, obviously each application will have different steps and might have different workflows, but this is just an idea how you can record and save typical user scenarios and then use it for your test in DiveCloud. So Nouvola provides a plugin in a Chrome extension that is called Nouvola DiveTrace, and it's this little cloud here that you see on the top. And when you click on it, it opens a control for a recording control. So when you click on record, then at this point, things that happen on this page will be recorded. Let's say that, you want to look at some of the flights, so you enter your data, and then, you click search, and then there's going to be, so as you can see, everything that we just did has been just recorded here. So let's take this as an example, and now we stop what we have, say, enough for our transactions, and then we can save it and call it Expedia session demo. Okay, so and then we click submit. And this automatically saves this transactions we just recorded into your account. And if you go under the sessions, or what we call the session manager, now we have our Expedia session thing. So at this point, if you click on it, you will see the list of all the requests as we recorded them. And if you click on each request, you will see information associated to this request. But for this first step, I'm going to leave it as is. And then we're going to go back to this part and we're going to go more into details on things that we can do to sessions. But let's assume that we have our ideal scenario, and we just want to make sure that we can validate, the scalability and robustness of this test of the applications for let's say hundreds of users or thousands of users. So what we want to do is to create a test plan, and so in order to do that, we click on this other tab, and then we create a new test. So we could call it this Expedia demo test, And then we can either use the existing default parameters, or we can modify them as we see fit. For instance, we could, one of the important things that it's, it will be change probably most tests is the load of the traffic. So you probably want to have, hundreds of users. Sometimes it could be thousands of users. And let's keep in mind, and when we are talking about users here, we are talking about users per second. So these are the concurrent users. They're going to execute this test. I'm going to start all in the same second concurrently, and then I'm going to repeat what we've seen here, in these transactions for as many times as the duration of the test allows. And in this case, is 10 minutes. We have other parameters here that are also default. One is related to the traffic model here. And by default is the model that we are using is what we call the linear ramp. So what it means is that the linear ramp allows you to increase the number of users up to the 1,000 that you put here as a maximum. And the number of users will increase in a step function, so with the fixed increments. In our case, there's going to be 10 different intervals. So with each of them, we'll start with 100 users, and then we'll increase 100 users per each step until it gets to thousands if we use this current model. Then you could have other parameters that by default are not turned on, like the use of think time, which is an interval that goes from a few milliseconds to up to 20 seconds that can be inserted either in between the calls or in between the transactions. And then you have to enter what you want to execute, so what these 1,000 users are going to execute. And so here we can go and take our Expedia session demo that we just recorded, and so there will be the transactions that we just saw. The other important parameter you see here is there's a response threshold. So this is also for now, is a default of 600 milliseconds, and is based on it's a kind of a number that we based on some of the Google's recommended load times for pages. So, but obviously this will be really depending on your applications or the target you have. It could be, 1 or 2 seconds could be considered acceptable, or you might have maybe just an API that you want to complete, in 50 milliseconds or something like that. So that will be really up to what is your target, which is, this one. So what it means is that when the test is executed, at the end, it will look at this threshold and will do a statistical comparison with the threshold and the average response times received and calculated during the execution. And then it will determine whether the test passed or failed. So this is particularly useful if you have an automation mechanism, so where your test is executed, let's say, as part of a Jenkins step or just a script that you have, and so you programmatically can see if your test is passing or failing. Let me pause here for a moment and see if you have questions.
Paula, I have one question.
Yes.
For the traffic load and that sort of thing for the users, I know that our account is based off of virtual minutes. How are virtual minutes calculated for a particular test?
Okay.
Is it?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, is it based off of the number for this one, for example? You've got 10 minutes with 1,000 users. Would that be 10,000 virtual user minutes then?
Yes. So if this was not a linear ramp. So the other way we can do it is not to use the linear ramp. So it would be that if you have 1,000 users from the first minute to the last one, so it's a constant traffic. So when you calculate it that way, then it would be 10,000 user minutes. Because it's a linear ramp, you will actually have 100 user minutes for the first minute, and then you will have 200 user minutes for the second minute, and so on. So it will be less than, and then at the end, the last minute is going to be 1,000. So you have about half of what you would have, so about 5,000 user minutes used. Okay, but it's calculated but the calculation is based on the number of users here and the number of minutes that you run the test for. So that's kind of the rough way of looking at it, for sure. Like I said, with the linear ramp, things are slightly less, so you get less minutes. But it's really the number of users that are physically being generated and for the duration of the test. So,
All right. Thank you, Paula.
you're welcome. Any other question? Okay, so let's take a brief look at some of the advanced features. In particular, I wanted to show you the ability of selecting different geographies. So if you look at this, then you have here, as you can see, it's a map of the world, and these are the different regions where we allow the execution of the test and the users. They can be selected simultaneously, so you could have, for instance, some users here, some users on the East Coast, and some users on the West Coast, let's say, or maybe another one in South America. And then you could also say, I don't know, I just do equal distribution, or you could also decide, I don't know, here I have only 30, or do 30 here and 20 here. Okay, as long as it rounds up to some, 200. And keep in mind that if the number that you entered here for some reason is not round, so you decide, I don't know, 327, then there's going to be some round up done here, when you do the calculation, because you cannot have half a user or a third of a user and so on. So they're all going to be, in a way, round up to what number makes sense based on this. And so this is, I think, these are the most important things that you need to know for the creation of a test plan. And we can just at this point go to save, and we've created our first test. And then at this point, if we wanted to execute it, we just select the test and click run. So because this is just a test on something that we don't own, the test should not be run, and therefore we are not going to do that. But that's as simple as it is. So the execution, so it's just by clicking the test, and at this point we take care of everything else. So the system generates instances as needed, and then each instance will run a few of the virtual users, and then we'll execute the steps, and then we collect results later on. So then there are other ways of executing the test. Once the test is created, there is an ID associated to it, as you can see here. And this can be used to run the test either via an API or via some of our plugins. And if we have time, maybe we can go over this, or if you are interested, we can go over this later. But for now, let's assume that the test has been run, and then we want to go and look at the results. So the results are shown here, and then actually if you run the test through the API, it's going to take you directly to the results. Just a second, actually, before we move there. Okay, so so you can see just the results for your specific test, or you can see results for all the test plans that are executed. Results are shown also in terms of, so they have the name of the test plan, but each of them will be identified by a timestamp. And you can add comments to the results, so that maybe, this is like your favorite execution and things like that. But let's take a look at some good example for the results. And we're looking at, in particular, at this execution. So what you see here is what the format that is used by all the results that we provide in general. So you have at the top what we call an executive summary with some information related to the type of test that we are running. Like in this case, it was 10 minutes with 40 users. Then there's a date when the test was run, and then it's telling you what regions were involved. In this case, it was only one. And then you start getting information about the outcome of the test. So the first thing you can see here, if there is a pass or fail, in this case, it's going to show you the fact that there are errors in the test. So even if the test has one error, this will going to show as error, so that it would just wants to draw your attention. And errors sometimes could be, especially if it's very low, very occasional, could be just related to some network glitches, or something like that. But we think it's a good idea that first will be at least analyzed before it can be dismissed. And then you have information like the average response time, the throughput, or the aggregated response time, which is the average response time for each of the steps for the whole scenario. So if you had multiple requests like we had recorded here, so that would be the total response time in average that it took to execute the full sequence. And so the next part here is showing instead the more details about the execution. So you can see the number of the total number of requests that were executed throughout the test, and they're also divided in intervals. So our test execution executes test in separate intervals. So it defines 10 intervals for now, and it's so and for each of them there's like the data are then collected and displayed. So what you see here, the one in turquoise are the successful requests, and if you hover on each interval, you can see how also you see the number of the requests that were successful and the numbers that could have instead shown errors. You also have the ability to filter out the different types of requests and just let's say, or just identify where you see server errors and so on. So what you have instead here, it's the request error rate. So you can see how in percentage these errors impact your total number of requests, if there are any. And then we can move on to the response time. So what you see here is also an example of a linear ramp traffic. So, and the green bars represent the number of users that were spawned at each of the intervals. And you see that the gray line instead is the response time. So you can see how the response time goes up as the number of users also increases. And then you see here this orange line, which is the threshold that we mentioned earlier. And so you also can see visually how this is obviously above the threshold. In the second graph, it's similar to the first one, but here you have a breakdown of the response times, where you can see the time to first byte, redirect, connection time, and so on. What is important also, you can see errors here. So you can see not only the different times, but also how errors play a role in the whole execution. So for instance, you can see that when the total response time starts growing, you go from 0 errors to instead some errors and higher up. And you also can see how there actually the errors at some point have a peak while the response time goes down. This is normally because the response time might be helped by, excuse me, by having more server errors and therefore rejecting some of the requests. Excuse me a second. Yeah, apologies for the pause. And
It's no problem.
thank you. And so what you see here then, so far we have seen the average response times. The next graph that you have here instead is the distribution of the times. And so also here you can see how spread out they are, like in this case, and how much, how many of the requests are actually above the threshold also that you had in mind. And at the bottom, what you see instead is the old list of the requests that were involved, in this exercise, and you can see how they are, color coded, and that's because of the errors. So if there are errors, then this will be the requests that are in red, so that you can immediately identify the one that could cause problems. And this table is totally sortable, so you can look, for instance, the higher response time or the highest median or the 90th percentile. So we could take also then at this point each individual request and look more into details of data related to this request. So here you can look at the errors in this case and response time in this case, and you see actually this particular request is always above the threshold, and you can see also other information. By the way, if you filter out here, you can also look at the smaller response time, and you can see, for instance, here there's also redirect time that gets involved, and so on. I think, I know this one doesn't, but there's others. Yeah, there is a pre-back end that it's, the one that contributes in the lower range to things. And and then you can also look at all the others requests if you want to. So you also have the ability of sharing this data with your colleagues or customers if you want to through this link. So it automatically opens a new window, and this window will be also able to do a lot of the things that you could do there, but you won't be able to go to other parts of your account unless you are the owner of this account, obviously. You also have the ability of downloading the CSV, that it's the raw data for this test. So you can just have data related to each individual request, when the request was done, which users, if there is a region, which region, and so on and so forth. So do you have questions related to this part?
Paula, I have a question. Um, with this data, is there a good way to see what the cause was of an error? If it, since it says a server error, is there a way to see what error what might have caused that through Nouvola,
Okay.
or is there? Oh, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, so there is so here you can see which errors they were, so you can know which request caused the error. So that's already, in a way, a hint that caused the server error. You can, excuse me, you can also use, we have right now a beta version of what we call Dive Data, which allows you to import information if you have a New Relic account from New Relic, and look at data from the server side in terms of what if there. This is not for errors, but this is more for like high execution time. Okay. So, but if you have errors, you were talking about errors like HTTP errors or problems in performance.
Mainly with problems in performance. I was thinking more about showing them the dive data stuff.
Yes.
if you have
Okay.
that available.
Yes. So I do have, I think, some other session, some other results that show some. I think this one could be an example of die data that you can see here, like what the type of results that you can have. So in this case, so what we did, we took all the New Relic metrics that were available to us and grouped them, and so that there's like a few hundred, a couple of hundred metrics, and then they're already grouped by New Relic into some sort of like hierarchical structure. So we kind of logically put some of these structures together as well, and identified these areas where errors or in performance, or at least changes in the performance could be detected. And then what we do, we take our metrics, like in terms of response times, and we look at a correlation between variation of the response times and the metrics provided by New Relic. So, and if we see that there is a high correlation, we can say, okay, for instance, maybe these methods are, the ones that could cause, the highest, the performance issues. So as you see here, like it could be something like a finding, probably, it's, on the on some queries that can be done, and here you can see like what in the query could be in the database, that could have caused the problems and so on. So they're not a guarantee that this is the area, but that there is a good possibility that because the response time went higher and these numbers went higher too, that there is a correlation between the two factors. Okay, so and this is possible if you do have a New Relic account. And then you can connect the account by going here to like APIs and keys, where you have also your APIs keys, and then adding here the proper information. There is also a possibility to look at your results from New Relic instead. And like in this example here, and I can show you, so where you have, if you go in your plugin and you have a Nouvola test, so if you run a test, if you set it up in your account, then each test here is then shown as a Nouvola in the list, and then you can just select a test, and then it will show up here in the Nouvola. So this will follow the New Relic data display rules, so it's going to be look different from what we have. But you could take these numbers and create, for instance, your own dashboard and things like that, and and add the information that you might get from your server, and look next to each other, if there is meaningful variations also in that area. Does it answer your question, Dave?
Yeah, it sure does. Anybody else got any questions? Nope.
Okay.
No questions so far.
Okay, so so far we have talked about yeah. So this was the basic workflow that we showed initially. So it was how do I get started? So I created a test. We assume at some point the test was run, and then we looked at results. So I would like now to go a little bit more in details about the things you can do in the test creation. So when we looked at our sessions, we just took this example, and we just took it kind of face value the way it is. But I wanted to also show you things that you could do to make your sessions a little bit more interesting, or sometimes really being able to use the test altogether. So one of the problems that often we are facing when we are, recording, real world scenarios is that a lot of the applications have logins. And so when we do have a login, then we need to reproduce this login when we run the test. So I'm going to show you here an example of simple example of a login and how you can deal with the credentials within this login. But this can apply to many other models, and obviously each login might have a slightly different way of handling things, and so it will depend on the type of application you have and the way this application handles with credentials. But what we could do is to first of all have the ability to execute the login steps with also with either one set of users or multiple set of users as you need. Sometimes even just one user is based on on a token that is generated when you start the login process, and therefore needs to be dynamically generated. So we cannot just take the recording and replay the way it is, because that will not work. So what we need to do then is a way to capture the values that are dynamically generated and use them then as needed in your session. So in this example, the first step of the login is generating a token, and this token is actually shown here as an example. It's also used as an example, so you get the idea. But you would have, as in your response, you will get something like an authenticity token here and a value. So what we want is to grab this value dynamically when it happens. And so what we can do is create a variable, and in this case it was already created, and then we assign to it a regular expression. And so we want to make sure that this regular expression grabs the correct value, and that's so that it's the value here. And then we want this expression coming from, in this case, the response of the request. Sometimes you might have values that are coming from the header of the response. Sometimes there could be values that you actually set up in the URL. Or you could have values in the the request body or the request header. So there's different ways that obviously you can play with this. And unfortunately, in in this training, I cannot cover all of them. And but we found it very interesting talking to different customers and see how you can resolve a lot of these dynamically generated values by using these variables and grabbing the values here. So in this case, then we have now this. So when the request is executed, this one, then it will just generate this token, and then this token, going back to our session, is going to be used here in this other request where we are actually passing the information for the users and password, username and password. So what you see here is that in the request data that are passed to the server, you get this token. And this token, so it's the variable that we just captured from the value before. So the variable that we created is global to the whole session. And so it can be used in any request that is associated to it. And then the other pieces of information that are important are the username and password. So when we recorded this session, there was a username and a password, just specific. But then we decided, okay, we want this to be valid for many users actually, and different types. So then we use again variables here, and let's see how we can use variables to create in two different ways. So one is a variable that in this case it's static. So, and that's the username. So we assume that the user is always this value here. And then we instead take the password from a file. And the file could be already a file that I have uploaded earlier, so it's here, or I can choose a file and get it from my my computer. So once the file is uploaded, then it's still as part of the system, and so it can then be used at any time. And so in the password, so at this point, so we have the ability to have multiple users and multiple, in this case, it's a single user because it's just here. But what we could do instead of having a variable for the user, we could actually go back and put this value here. And have here another way of randomizing, and we say, let's say that I have more accounts, and each of them has, in this case, the same password. Okay, so you can see here then how I now generated a random value between 1 and 7 that will be used anytime we execute. So this is the way, and there is this brief help here that you can use, where you can generate the value. And actually, in this case, it's dash. Okay, so when you're here, then you could then use so different ways of randomizing. In this case, in a way, really more out of control from you. So, but where you can have creating just letters or numbers or a combination of both. You can have a range, or you can use it, a combination of them, like in this case. So all this is possible, and so you can just use it that way. Once you're ready, so at this point, what we will have is like that every time we execute this login, we could enter as different users. So we could be now just run anybody that it's between 1 and 7, and they will use the same password here. Okay. Do you have questions for this part?
I have one. So how does this handles cookies? Like when you record your test or your session.
Yeah. So,
between requests, it saves the cookies automatically.
Yeah, so the cookies are here, and normally I think they are regenerated unless, I mean, if they are important, they're normally automatically generated with the request. So they're captured and reused as they are here. Okay. You can change this if you don't want to use the cookie. You can just, want the system to ignore them. Every single field is editable, and you can also add additional things like your own cookie or things like that if you want to. So that's kind of up to you. But yeah, you can play around with all these things. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So once you create this type of session, sometimes you want to run, want to make sure that this works. So then you run what we call the validation. So if you click here, it will allow you to check that these steps make sense. And then if, like in this case, you can see if you open then the results, the new token that was generated here, and then if there was the response, what it was, and there are headers and so on. Okay. So that's what's related to what we call, parameterizations and randomization of sessions. So, and this is one example. Another example that I will go briefly is just if you have a form, like for instance here, so you could also then generate and give some example here in the request, also the way of generating numbers this way and having also first name and so on, and also here there's tokens that probably needs to be passed and so on. And then you can use also here files, similar to what we saw before. You will also have the ability of capturing the results of these things. So let's say that you are creating this name and then you want to reuse it. You could also create a variable that grabs the response of this or grabs this value and says, okay, in the request data, what is the exact value that I actually created so that I can use it later, because then I'm going to be maybe these users and do something else, and so keep it for further steps. But what I would like to show you now, it's also the ability that we have to create what we call multi-sessions. So sometimes, you might, like what we did earlier, we created a login, and then you might want to, after login, do different scenarios. So sometimes you might just like assuming that you are, you're logging in into your Expedia account, then you might want to say, oh, have a user that does car reservations or something else, and so then you can create, but you can always use the same type of accounts. So you can still use the login that you had, but then you attach different pieces below. So you could create what we call then a sequential session, where the first thing would be a login, let's say like this, and then and you would be your first step, and then the second step could be instead the demo we just created. So that would be step number 2. So at this point, if there were a token here or information that are important, the variables created here are going to be global to the whole session, so that you can share it and create more complex scenarios this way. The other thing instead you could do in alternative, instead you could say, okay, I want to have actually my load, I want to generate a load where I have different types of scenarios. Like I might have some users that there are just reserving a car, and some users that instead are reserving flights. So then what you can do, you can do a parallel session and say, I don't know, let's see if I have another scenario. And let's say that this is like when I do an Expedia search, and this is instead when I do an Expedia flight. And then I could say 30% of my users are doing this and 70% of my users are doing that. Okay, so that's another way of creating scenarios. And then you can see it here. So then you will show here, like if these are parallel, these are doing, so a certain number of users are doing this and others are doing that. Or here you have, login, browsing, and log out. So this can be also steps that you can attach together. And these are all sessions that you need to have created here in your session manager first. Questions on this side? Okay, so far we have talked about DiveTrace.
Sorry.
Yeah? Oh, sorry.
One question. I see. Sorry. I see in the last column, save via. It's a postman. We can create the test without the interface of you.
Yes, exactly. So that's what I was gonna say next.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay.
Great
Okay.
timing.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we just saw, as I was saying, that we created things using Nouvola DiveCloud, but there's actually other ways that you can create scenarios. And and we have different possibilities here. So one is what is also described here, which is the use of die proxy. So die proxy is a proxy, and here it's telling you how to connect to that proxy. So you can use this. This is useful in situations where you cannot record from the browser. In particular, that's when you are in for instance, in a mobile application. So what you need to do in this case is to go to your mobile device, and I cannot show you here. Obviously, it's hard to do through online. But if you have, your local device that you want to record, your application, some steps of it, go to the device network configuration. So and look at a way. So each mobile device has slightly different ways of connecting to a proxy. I can show you on the computer here, like you will have to go to the system preferences and go to the network, like we said, and then go to advanced, and from the advanced go to proxies. And then you can have a web proxy here, and then the information in my case are already entered. You do need a password to do this, so you can just, but that's a way to get into the proxy. Okay, so once you're connected, then, and you do it from your device, then from the same device, you can also in the browser start a dive proxy, open the dive proxy page like this one that you see here from the browser. So log into the DiveCloud, go to the sessions, click on dive proxy, and then once you're ready to record, click record the dive proxy session. So here they might ask you for the password, and then you can also start the recording of your application, so execute the steps in your applications. So keep in mind that the dive proxy is, once it starts recording, is going to record anything that goes through your device. So you should try to keep the device relatively clean from other apps, and it should limit your recording to really the area that you want to record. So that it makes it easier to, instead of doing a lot of cleanup later. But so once you do record, then once you're happy with your steps, go back to the browser in your device, click stop recording, and then the session will automatically show up here. And if you look here in the dive proxy, usually shows up show up automatically with a timestamp. So if you get but if you can go there and then change the timestamp with a name. Any session is editable, so you can just go there and say, I want to call it something else, and you can call it something else. So that's one way of recording things. A second way. Then you have the ability to import from Postman. And so from Postman, you can create a Postman session. And actually, let me start Postman. And Postman has this concept of collections and has the ability to export. So if you go to one collection here, you can say export, and once you do the export, it's going to ask you to put it on a file. I have already actually all these files, but if you go back to then the application here, I can just go and do the import. And in the import, I can do Postman file, and then the Postman will be just recorded. And this is an example of a Postman where you have 3 requests. And so the request, they save the data, like if you have things in the headers, like in this case, there's an API keys that are necessary, and so on. You can just go and edit this, okay? And then you make changes. So then they will behave exactly as you can see. They look and behave as any other of the sessions that you have. So that's the Postman way. Then there is also the ability of exporting and re-importing sessions. This is very useful if you have to do a lot of global changes. Let's say that you have something like this registration form, was pretty long, and maybe you have to change something in each single request or in many of them. So what I find it easier is then to export the form. So with this way, so you do the export, and at this point the form gets exported, and it will be exported in JSON format. So you can then edit the file, make your own changes. Sometimes it takes some time because if the session is long, but so you can then do use better editors to edit the full JSON and make the changes that you want to make, and then once you're happy, you can re-import here, and then the import in this case will be the DiveCloud session. And then of course you will look, this was actually an import, and it looks exactly like that. It's also useful if you have multiple accounts to share sessions with your colleagues. So you can just export it, so and then they can import on their side, and so it can be used also by others. Do you have questions? Does this answer your question on Postman?
Yeah, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, and then there is one last way of creating session, which is manual. And this is rather, so what you have here, you can create a session, you can have get, post, put, delete, and you can create here the URL. So in this case, it will only create the URL here, so there's no headers or other informations, but you can then go, once you create it this way, let's see if I have an example of manual. Yes, so if I have like here, like something like that, it will be, the first time will be recorded as with nothing, but then I could go there and instead add information like I showed you earlier, you can add the API, so I manually edit the API here, okay? And then you can also add other data if you want to. So that's so any of these fields is editable. So once you created the basics. Okay, so these are all the different ways you can look at your session and transactions. And then no matter how they've been created, you can always use multi-sessions and use them in any place, any test you like.
Okay, sorry. Then you can only export or create import session, or multi-session can be import too.
No, multi-sessions cannot be imported at the moment. Okay. So the option is only for sessions. Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions on this? And I'm also considerate of the time. We kind of running out of our time, but if you have a few more minutes, I'm happy to stay longer. Yeah, I wanted to mention, I think, one more thing that I think it's important, and then Dave, you tell me also if I missed anything, is the APIs and integrations with other solutions. So if you go on the online help here for Nouvola, so if you look at the API, you see here that there is one section related just to APIs. So you can run tests, like I said earlier, once a test is created, you can run it outside of DiveCloud. And you can use the informations that are here to create and to execute your own tests and create your own scripts, for instance. So what you need for running a test is the plan ID that I showed you earlier, that it's during creation, it just gets automatically added. And then what is the API key? So your account key, which is the API, which is shown in the account, like I showed you earlier. So each account has its own API. And then once you have that, you can create just a request this way. And these are so at that point, this will return this message, and it will have, and also where there is an ID. So that ID is important if you want to verify and look programmatically at the outcome of the test. So this ID is, as shown here in the results, the API to look at the results. So that's the same idea we saw earlier. And you look here and you can see how then it can be used to get the results back. Okay, so you can then use still the same API key. And then in this case, you pass this instance ID. So no more the test plan, but the test, the particular instance. So if the test is completed, you will have different results. But if the test is running, what you will see is something similar. So it's going to show you that the status of the test is working and the outcome is still pending. Once the test is completed, so the status will be emailed, because every time that that a test is executed, there is an email. It gets emailed at the end. And so once it's emailed, that means that the status, the test is completed. And in that case, then you can also look at the outcome that is coming out here, but also you can get the full set of results, like it's shown here in JSON format, that are based on the graphs that you've seen in DiveCloud. So you can also get programmatically all this. And there's also other ways of adding queries to the API. So you just get a URL or get something with a certain method and so on, or some session. So you might just look at something for a session, etc. So that it's very helpful if you want to do the programmatically run a test. And in this case, what I normally do, I have some way of polling, and so that until this is in the emailed status, and then so that I can get the results. There is another way if you don't want a poll, which is the use of webhooks. So there's the ability of creating a webhook, and the webhook, it's also based on your API, and in this case also that's the test plan. And then once you have a webhook associated, then it will you will have obviously to provide your callback and decide what you want. So we need to have all set up on your side to accept requests. And then once the test is completed, you will get a request, and the callback contains this type of information. That's the format you will get. So so this is a way of collecting results programmatically. But then if you use tools like Jenkins, I don't know if you use Jenkins in general, or I can show you in Jenkins, like you can have a Nouvola step in your configuration. So you have to obviously to install the Nouvola plugin, And then once you have that installed, you can just add here a step and run Nouvola DiveCloud. And again, it will ask you for the plan ID and the API key. And that's all you need. Okay. And once that's completed, if you go to the build, to the artifacts, you could also have a link to a page where there is a link to the results. So that's also associated with the build. There is a similar plugin for TeamCity, and there's also a similar plugin for AWS Code Pipeline if you use any of these tools. Okay, I think this concludes in a way what I was planning to present to you. I don't know if there's anything else, Dave, that you would like to see, or if you have other questions, anybody has questions.